Hello everybody and welcome to today's video where we're going to be talking about a more complex game design topic, and that is gameplay length. If you're making a video game, how long should it take for someone to complete your game? Now this topic actually applies to all different types of games, whether your game is kind of a fixed length like a single player story driven type game, or it's a little more open-ended, maybe it's a multiplayer focused game. And so the short answer to the question of how long should your game be is it's complicated and it really depends on the type of game that you're trying to make. But with today's video, I just want to show how it's less about the exact raw number of how long your game takes to complete, like how many hours it takes to complete, and it's more about your player experience overall. So today I'm going to be talking about what that player experience looks like for different types of games, some of the considerations that you need to make when you're thinking about your gameplay length, as well as how to increase or decrease the length of your game. But before I get into all that, I'd just like to say if you did find today's topic interesting, I'd really appreciate if you hit that like button. Also feel free to subscribe to the channel for lots more videos about topics related to game development. And I do want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on gameplay length? What is the ideal length for you that you think a game should be? Also, real quickly, I'd just like to mention that the Unity Asset Store is holding one of their mega bundle sales where they basically have different tiered levels where depending on what level that you purchase at, you get access to more things, and it's going to be going on for a couple more weeks. So feel free to check out the link in the description below so you can get some more information on that. So anyways, gameplay length, let's talk about it. So if you take away one thing from today's video, it should just be that you don't want to focus on the exact raw number of how long your game takes to play, and you should really be focusing on the player experience of your game. Now, one way that you can visualize this is by using a graph. So if you picture a graph where the horizontal axis, we have the time it takes to play your game, and on the vertical axis, we basically have the intensity or the difficulty of your game. Now on this graph, if we plot two parallel lines going up and to the right, we can kind of use these as guidelines, and these want to be kind of like our boundaries for, how intense the game should be as we progress through the story of our game. So now the ideal spot is to kind of sit right in between these two boundary lines. And ideally what you'd want to happen is to actually kind of be bouncing back and forth between these upper and lower bounds. So as the game progresses and things start to get, more intense and more difficult, you don't want to overwhelm your player with more difficulty. You want to pull it back and kind of give them a chance to take a break and kind of process what happened every once in a while. But then you don't want to go too far in that other direction to the point where they start getting bored. So then you're going to have to start ramping up the intensity again, and you want to bring that intensity back up a little bit higher than it was before so they continue to stay engaged in your game. So this is why a lot of times in video games you'll have a really intense combat section followed by maybe a little bit of kind of like puzzle solving or maybe a relaxed cutscene, and then all of a sudden you're back into the action and it's going to be a little bit more intense than it was before, and then before you know it you're all of a sudden back to doing some more puzzles. But maybe this puzzle is a little bit more challenging than the one before, or the stakes are just a little bit higher. Maybe there's a time limit that you have to finish the puzzle by. So there's still ways to kind of up the intensity even in the slower parts of your game. So now let's talk about gameplay length for different types of games that we're making. So one common type of game that you may be even making yourself right now is something known as a vertical slice. Now a vertical slice is essentially a demo of your game, and it's something to basically give the players an idea of what they can expect from the final product of your game. Now this is the one thing that I will say that there is like a pretty much a sweet spot, a good time to always strive for, and I say that's about 10 to 20 minutes. So basically you want to let the player be able to play this game in just one sitting in a quick amount of time, whether you're showing off the game at a convention or if it's just someone who's downloading your game off the internet. You really just want to give the players a taste of the atmosphere of your game, kind of what they can expect from the main gameplay loop of the game, and then finish off with a little teaser of things to come, maybe leave it on a cliffhanger there at the end for you. But really you kind of just want to walk them through, one iteration of this kind of graph cycle that we're talking about, maybe kind of just introduce some of the basic mechanics to the player, ramp things up with maybe a little bit of a combat section, and then we can kind of pull it back with a little bit of a story cutscene to give them more of an idea of what's going on in your game, and then we can kind of ramp it up again a little bit and then leave them on a cliffhanger so then they're excited about your game. But again, doesn't matter if you're making a single player game, multiplayer game, whatever. Just strive for that gameplay length to be about 10 to 20 minutes long. Alright, so let's talk about gameplay length for fixed length games. So oftentimes these are single player story driven games, or maybe they're level driven games where basically you're playing through a set amount of levels, something that you'd see in like a puzzle game or maybe a more traditional 2D platformer. So to get kind of a breakdown of some of the different gameplay types that you can track, one of my favorite websites to go to is howlongtobeat.com. And it basically gives you an idea of how long on average it takes for a player to, just play through the main story of your game, the main story and a couple extras like some side quests and things like that. Or if you want to do a full completionist run and get like the platinum trophy or 1,000 gamer score, basically doing everything that you can possibly do in that game. Now when you're making your game, in general, really just make the game as long as it needs to be, but don't make it overstay its welcome. You don't want to force players to do a bunch of boring and repetitive things just to increase the gameplay length of your game for whatever reason. And I think one of the most important parts, especially for these fixed length type games, is knowing your player base. And so one way you can kind of do this is look at some games that are similar to yours and get to know kind of their communities. If you go into the forums for that particular game, are you seeing a lot of people, wishing that they had more of this game to play and more of maybe, certain encounters? Or are you seeing complaints from people about saying, I really love this game, but this part just kind of dragged on too much, or there were maybe too many fetch quests that I didn't really like? That should kind of give you an idea about the types of content to put in your game. Now for me, I like single player games a lot, especially ones that are kind of on the shorter side, because I like to be able to play through a game within 1 or 2 sittings, and then I can feel like I experienced pretty much the full extent of that game without missing out on anything. Because unfortunately, I just don't have that much time to dedicate into some of these massive 100-hour long video games anymore. So when I go to a website like How Long to Beat and I see that a game maybe takes 60, 70 hours, it's got to be a really dang good game for me to want to start investing that amount of time, just because I don't get the chance to play that many video games. But again, those are just my personal preferences. Now, maybe the target audience for your game is much different. Maybe the target audience for your game are the type of people who are willing to put in, multiple hours a day for several days in a row to finish or even complete your game. You just got to know your player base. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about some of these open-ended type games. So maybe you're making a multiplayer-centric game, or you're making a single player game that has a high level of replayability, such as these highest score arcade driven type games, or you're making a strategy game where people can come up with different strategies. And that's sort of the draw of the game, is to get people to try out different ways to complete your game. Now of course it's going to be extremely difficult to quantify how long someone's going to spend time with your game, because that's really up to them and how they're feeling, how much engagement and enjoyment they're getting out of your game. And if you're continually giving that to them, maybe they'll play your game for hundreds or even thousands of hours. However, if they're just not getting that, maybe they'll just play it a few times and drop it. So instead of thinking about kind of the overall time about how long it's going to take to complete your game, maybe you can start to think about, how long is a typical gameplay session going to be? Is this kind of a simple little game that people are only going to play for a few minutes at a time? Or is it something that they're going to want to sit down and actually play for multiple hours? And once you have a good idea about this, you can start to add in some gameplay elements. So maybe, you can have kind of a boost. So for the next 10 minutes, you get, double XP. So that really, forces people to play that full 10 minutes long, even if your average gameplay length is maybe about, 6 or 7 minutes. Also, you need to keep in mind the frequency of how often people are coming back to your game. So is this something that people are playing, multiple times throughout the day? Or is this something that they're playing once a day? Or maybe they're only playing it 2 or 3 times a week, just kind of on the weekends? What's kind of the frequency for how often the average person is going to play your game? And again, you can kind of tie in some daily rewards or daily missions to encourage players to come back to your game on whatever kind of regular basis. And so with more of these open-ended games, instead of tracking the amount of time that it takes to play through your game, because you can't really do that, you should instead track milestones. So how long does it take to level up in your game? How long does it take to unlock a certain item? You know, how long does it take to reach the max level in your game? So you need to figure out what are these kind of milestones in your game, and how long is it going to take the player to reach those milestones, and how much time are they willing to actually put in to reach those milestones. So again, that comes back to really just knowing your player base. Let's talk about some ways where you can adjust the length of your game to make it a little bit longer or a little bit shorter depending on what you need. So of course, one way to make your game longer is to add more content to your game. Now, creating new content is the most ideal situation, but that's not always realistic. You know, you have deadlines to meet, and I'm sure that your whole team is already going to be overloaded with work, so giving them just kind of more work is no good, and you don't necessarily want to increase the scope of your game too much. However, what you can do is reuse some of your older content in the game, but with a twist. Make it something new and a little bit more interesting just by tweaking it a little bit. You know, maybe combine it with something else that was in your game previously to make kind of some third new thing that's new and interesting for the player. But just be careful not to be super lazy with this and do a simple palette swap and just kind of increase the damage values a little bit, because players will often see through that and they're just going to think, oh, this guy is adding a bunch of filler content to his game. Now, if you determine that the length of your game is good for the average general player, but maybe not the most hardcore of people, then this is where you can start to add in side quests and things like that to really make good on your most hardcore fans without giving the average player too much content. But again, you just need to be careful here and just make sure you're not adding in length for the sake of adding length. Make sure everything that you add actually increases the value of your game and makes it more enjoyable in some sense. So don't add in a bunch of unskippable cutscenes that don't actually add anything to the story, and don't add in a bunch of redundant tasks just to give the player something to do so they play your game a little bit longer. So let's talk about making your game shorter. So of course, one way to make your game shorter is to remove content from your game. So I know removing content from your game can be something that you don't really want to do. You feel like you worked really hard on everything in your game and you don't want to scrap that stuff. I get it. But if your game is dragging on for just a little bit too long, then something is going to have to go. So at this point, you really need to analyze everything in your game and look for the things that don't necessarily fit into your game. Look at all the things that aren't really providing anything positive to your game and just go ahead and ditch that stuff. Or maybe find that the player is doing something over and over and over again. Maybe you can kind of spread out some of those instances that they're doing that thing and kind of remove that a couple times so they're not doing it as frequently. You're kind of spreading that stuff out over the course of the game. And then another way to reduce your gameplay time is by streamlining content. And so with doing this, you don't necessarily have to remove anything, but you're actually giving the players tools to complete your game faster. So, maybe over time you kind of increase the ways that the player can move around your game world. Maybe they can, upgrade the vehicles they have, which allows them to travel from place to place faster, or maybe you add in some type of fast travel system. If your game is a combat focused game, maybe you give your players better abilities over time that can defeat enemies quicker, or maybe even you can introduce a mechanic where they can essentially skip battles with lower level opponents just because once you've been playing the game for a while, players proven that they can defeat those enemies no problem. So maybe they can just do one quick strike on the enemy and then continue on with playing your game. So anyways, I think that's about all I have to say in today's video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I would really like to hear from you. What are your thoughts on gameplay length? What is kind of the ideal length of a game that you want to experience, and what is your kind of target length for your game that you're making right now? How long do you want people to be playing your game for? So anyways, I hope you all found today's video useful and interesting. If you did, I'd really appreciate if you hit that like button. Also, feel free to subscribe to the channel for lots more videos about video game development. And don't forget that the Unity Asset Store is hosting a mega bundle sale right now. So again, go check that out with the links in the description below. And I think that's about all I got for you today. So I hope you all have a fantastic rest of your day, and I'll see you in the next one.